The year is 1975. A world divided by the Cold War. Washington and Moscow locked in a geopolitical chess match. But in the Southern Hemisphere, quietly, ruthlessly, a different kind of war was unfolding. Not fought openly on the battlefield, but in the shadows. A network of generals, dictators, and spies stitched together across South America. Their mission? To eliminate subversives, to crush dissent, and to make their regimes untouchable. Welcome back to Facts on Trial. This was Operation Condor, a multinational campaign of terror, surveillance, and assassination. Not an official war, not something written into treaties or declared to the United Nations, but a secret pact sealed in blood. It was the birth of a transnational killing machine. Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, Brazil. Later, even Ecuador and Peru. All locked together by one thread, military juntas determined to erase their enemies. But Condor was more than just a pact of convenience. It was a system, an underground railroad of death. Information flowed across borders. Dissidents who thought they had escaped their homeland found themselves hunted in exile. Refuge was an illusion. No matter where you fled, Buenos Aires, Santiago, Montevideo, Sao Paulo, the Condor could find you. The idea of Operation Condor was born in Santiago, Chile, in the aftermath of the bloody 1973 coup that overthrew President Salvador Allende. General Augusto Pinochet, with quiet backing from the CIA, toppled a democratically elected government and installed a regime that ruled by fear. And it was in this crucible of dictatorship that Condor spread its wings. The name itself was no accident. The Condor, a massive vulture native to the Andes, circles high above before descending on its prey. Cold, patient, inevitable. That was how the generals saw themselves, as guardians of their nations, cleansing them of enemies. But in reality, Condor was not about national security. It was about control. It was about crushing labor leaders, silencing priests who spoke for the poor, erasing students who dared to dream of a different future. Condor's victims were writers, journalists, doctors, and teachers. And the methods, kidnapping, torture, disappearances, would leave scars on entire nations. Behind the dictators stood something even darker, the backing of Western intelligence agencies, especially the CIA. For Washington, obsessed with stopping the spread of communism, these generals were seen as allies. The methods, though brutal, were tolerated and often quietly supported. But as history would later reveal, Operation Condor was not just about crushing communism. It was about power, money, and erasing anyone who dared resist authoritarian rule. And in the shadows of South America, the blood of thousands marked its trail. The Congo was not just any territory. It was a jewel in the crown of European colonial plunder. Under King Leopold II of Belgium, the land had been brutalized in one of history's most violent colonial experiments. Rubber, ivory, copper, gold. The resources flowed out, while Congolese bodies piled up by the millions. When Belgium was finally forced to relinquish control in 1960, the handover was chaotic. They left behind almost no infrastructure, no educated elite, no roadmap for self-governance. But they did leave behind something else, an economy tied tightly to Western corporations and governments that had no intention of letting Congo slip from their grasp. In this tinderbox, Patrice Lumumba emerged. He was young, charismatic, and fiercely intelligent. Unlike many leaders who played cautiously with their former colonial masters, Lumumba spoke directly to his people about dignity and self-determination. He insisted the Congo's vast resources, uranium, cobalt, diamonds, copper, should benefit Congolese people first, not foreign companies. This was not just rhetoric. In the heart of the Cold War, uranium from Congolese mines had powered the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The US and its allies understood one thing clearly. Congo was not just a country, it was a battlefield in the global struggle for dominance. Lumumba's rise to power in June 1960 set off alarms in Washington, London, and Brussels. He was seen as unpredictable, dangerously independent, perhaps even leaning toward Moscow. To the west, the nightmare scenario was that the Congo, a resource-rich giant at the heart of Africa, might tilt toward the Soviet Union. Within days of independence, the crisis began. Soldiers of the Congolese army mutinied against their Belgian commanders. Riots broke out. Belgian officials and families fled in panic. And then came the move that would fracture the nation. Katanga Province, the richest mining region of the Congo, declared secession under the leadership of Moise Tshombe, with heavy Belgian backing. Katanga was not just a rebellious province. It was where Union Miniere, the Belgian mining giant, held its crown jewels: uranium, copper, cobalt. With Katanga gone, Congo would be crippled. Lumumba, desperate to hold the country together, turned first to the United Nations. He asked for peacekeepers, for assistance to expel the Belgian troops who were still interfering in Congo's affairs. The UN responded, slowly, cautiously, unwilling to fully confront Belgian interests. Frustrated, Lumumba made the fateful choice that sealed his fate. He reached out to the Soviet Union for assistance. Moscow agreed to supply planes, trucks, and advisors. To Western intelligence agencies, this was confirmation of their darkest fears. Patrice Lumumba was slipping into the Soviet orbit. What happened next was a perfect storm of Cold War paranoia and neo-colonial scheming. The CIA, MI6, and Belgian intelligence began to discuss how to remove Lumumba. Not through elections, not through negotiation, but through assassination. The conspiracy to remove Lumumba was not confined to Congo alone. It stretched across continents, boardrooms, and intelligence agencies. At its core was a web of fear, a belief that Patrice Lumumba was too dangerous to be left alive. In Washington, President Dwight D. Eisenhower reportedly gave a chilling order during a National Security Council meeting in August 1960. Multiple witnesses later testified that he authorized the CIA to eliminate Lumumba. The word itself hung in the air like smoke, vague enough to be denied, but lethal in its intent. At CIA headquarters in Langley, a plan was drafted. Sidney Gottlieb, the agency's infamous poison master and head of the MK-Ultra mind control experiments, was dispatched to the Congo with a bizarre toolkit. Hidden in his luggage was a vial of poison, specifically formulated to mimic a tropical disease. The plan was simple: slip the toxin into Lumumba's food or toothpaste, leaving no trace. But the scheme faltered. The CIA's local contacts could not get close enough to Lumumba in prison, and the poison remained unused. Yet, this attempt reveals the sheer lengths to which the agency was willing to go. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Brussels was plotting its own intervention. Belgian officials, deeply tied to Katanga's mining interests, feared that Lumumba's continued survival would lead to the nationalization of their prized assets. Secret cables exchanged between Brussels and Congolese authorities were blunt. Lumumba must not be allowed to return to power. To seal his fate, Belgium and its allies worked with Joseph Mobutu, who had staged a coup against Lumumba with CIA funding. Mobutu, still consolidating his power, acted as the middleman. He ensured that Lumumba remained imprisoned, cut off from the outside world, while Belgian and Katangan officials debated his ultimate fate. But assassination is never just a single act. It is a theater of complicity. The United Nations, under Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, officially maintained neutrality. Yet UN troops in Congo, instead of freeing Lumumba, stood by as Mobutu's forces arrested and transported him. Historian Ludo de Witte later called it a case of murder by neglect, as the international community watched, silently complicit. As these decisions unfolded, Lumumba himself remained resolute. In prison, he penned letters to his wife Pauline, assuring her that Congo's future would outlast his own. "Neither brutality nor cruelty nor torture will ever force me to ask for mercy," he wrote. These words would outlive him, becoming the testament of a man who saw his destiny written in the sacrifice of his body. The clock was ticking. And in the smoke-filled rooms of Brussels, Washington, and Katanga, the decision was made. Lumumba would die. The Phoenix program was not just about intelligence collection or surgical strikes. It was about breaking people, physically, psychologically, spiritually. Captured suspects were taken to clandestine interrogation centers, often nondescript buildings in provincial capitals, warehouses on the outskirts of villages, or basements of South Vietnamese police stations. On the outside, they looked like any other government facility. Inside, they became theaters of horror. Reports from defectors, whistleblowers, and U.S. congressional investigations describe a grim pattern: waterboarding, electric shocks, beatings with rubber hoses, confinement in pitch-black rooms, mock executions. One survivor recalled being tied to a wooden board, water forced down his throat until he thought he would drown. Another spoke of being stripped, blindfolded, and shocked with wires clipped to his ears. Women were not spared. Many faced sexual violence under the guise of interrogation. The Americans often distanced themselves. Officially, torture was carried out by South Vietnamese forces, not U.S. personnel. But CIA advisors were present in many facilities, guiding the questions, watching the results, and keeping records. They may not have held the whip, but they pulled the strings. By 1970, the scale of abuse was undeniable. A U.S. Army officer who had worked inside the program testified before Congress, calling Phoenix a sterile, depersonalized murder program. Another whistleblower described detainees disappearing, their families never notified, their names erased. The numbers were staggering. By the end of the war, estimates suggest that more than 80,000 suspected Viet Cong were neutralized under Phoenix. Of these, thousands were killed outright, often without trial or even a shred of proof. The program blurred every moral line. It wasn't about winning hearts and minds anymore. It was about instilling fear so deep that even whispering sympathy for the Viet Cong could mean a death sentence. Yet paradoxically, this brutality may have only strengthened the insurgency. Survivors who escaped carried tales of torture back to their villages. Families whose sons or daughters disappeared often turned against the South Vietnamese government and against America. Instead of breaking the resistance, Phoenix sometimes poured fuel on it. And still, the program continued, quietly supported at the highest levels of Washington because it fit the logic of the times. The Cold War demanded results, and the line between security and atrocity grew thinner with every passing year. In these black sites of Vietnam, America crossed a threshold that it would one day cross again. In Latin America, in the Middle East, in places like Abu Ghraib. Phoenix was the prototype. The war in Vietnam was being fought not just in jungles and rice paddies, but in the hidden chambers of fear. And the ghosts of those chambers still whisper today. On January 17, 1961, Patrice Lumumba, once the most powerful man in Congo, was no longer a leader, no longer even a prisoner of dignity. He was now cargo, transported under guard, shackled, beaten, his body broken, but his spirit unyielding. Lumumba, along with two close allies, Maurice Mpolo and Joseph Okito, was flown to Katanga. This secessionist province was run by Moise Tshombe and his Belgian backers, the very men who had long sought his death. They were driven into the darkness, arriving at a remote villa owned by a Belgian officer. The final chapter of his life was already scripted by foreign hands. Lumumba's killers were not Congolese alone. Belgian officers, Katangan leaders, and European mercenaries prepared for the deed. The United States may have planned, but Belgium executed. Lumumba and his companions were dragged into the room. They had been beaten all day, spit on, paraded before hostile crowds. Yet Lumumba's eyes, swollen and bloodied, still carried defiance. Witnesses recall his final words, spoken in a soft but steady voice. History will one day have its say. It will not be the history taught in Brussels, Paris, or Washington, but the history taught in the countries that have freed themselves from colonialism. Africa will write its own history. The executioners lined them up against trees. Shots rang out, first Mpolo, then Okito, and finally Lumumba. He fell in the red dust of Katanga, the same soil he had sworn to defend from foreign rule. But the crime was not complete. His body was loaded onto a truck, driven deeper into the bush. Belgian officers feared a grave might become a shrine, so they carried out an act meant to erase him from history itself. For 2 nights, Belgian officers cut Lumumba's body into pieces, dissolved them in sulfuric acid, and scattered the remains. A tooth, plucked like a trophy, was kept by one officer hidden for decades. His voice silenced, his body destroyed, yet his memory refused to die. Narrator. Patrice Lumumba's assassination was not just the murder of a man, it was the attempt to murder the dream of African independence. But dreams do not dissolve in acid. They live on in memory, in struggle, and in history's relentless pursuit of truth. The night of January 17, 1961, hangs like a black curtain over history. Patrice Lumumba, once the most powerful man in the Congo, was now a prisoner, stripped of dignity but not of conviction. His wrists were bound, his clothes torn, his body bearing the bruises of countless beatings. He was no longer in the grand halls of Leopoldville, nor in the chambers of international diplomacy. He was in Katanga, the secessionist stronghold that had conspired with Belgium to ensure his silence would be eternal. The men who held him were not merely executioners, they were instruments of empire. Belgian officers, Congolese gendarmes, and Katangan officials all stood as accomplices. They did not see a man before them, but a symbol. Lumumba was more dangerous in life than in death, for his words could awaken a nation, and his vision could ignite a continent. It is said that Lumumba, even in those final hours, remained defiant. He told his captors that history would remember, that Congo would not forever be enslaved, and that his death would not be the end of the dream. His voice, though weakened, carried a strange calm. To the men who guarded him, he seemed to understand that his fate was sealed, but to the future, he was planting a seed. The execution itself was carried out with cold efficiency. In a remote clearing outside Elizabethville, Lumumba and two of his loyal ministers, Joseph Okito and Maurice Mpolo, were lined up before a firing squad. Belgian officers gave the orders, ensuring that the crime was masked as local justice. The shots rang out in the night, shattering not only 3 lives, but the fragile hope of an independent Congo. Yet even in death, Lumumba haunted his killers. They feared that his body could become a shrine, a rallying point for resistance. So they conspired to erase him from the earth. His body was exhumed, dismembered, and dissolved in acid under the supervision of Belgian Police Commissioner Gerard Souete. The grotesque act was meant to obliterate him, to leave no trace, no grave, no relic. But instead, it immortalized the crime, ensuring that whispers of conspiracy would echo across generations. The Congo awoke the next morning not to the promise of liberation, but to the weight of betrayal. The international community issued muted condemnations, but the truth, that Western powers Belgium and the United States all had blood on their hands, was buried beneath layers of Cold War politics. The world moved on, but in the shadows of Kinshasa, in the villages along the Congo River, and in the hearts of Africans across the continent, Lumumba's name became legend. This was not just the execution of a man. It was the silencing of a vision, the elimination of a leader who dared to believe that Africa could be free, united, and sovereign. But even acid could not dissolve an idea. Lumumba's death was meant to extinguish hope, yet it forged a martyr. His final words, carried by memory and whispered across generations, would prove true. History did not forget. The Cold War eventually ended. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union dissolved. Yet, even as the world celebrated the dawn of a new order, the shadows of Operation Gladio lingered. In Italy, parliamentary inquiries confirmed the existence of a secret stay-behind network, armed, trained, and partly funded by NATO. The Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti admitted to Parliament in 1990 that Gladio was real, though he insisted it had been necessary during the Cold War. The disclosure rocked Europe, especially as it coincided with revelations tying Gladio-linked groups to massacres of civilians. But what truly horrified the public was the idea that their democracies, nations that prided themselves on liberty, transparency, and the rule of law, had hosted secret armies operating outside of parliamentary oversight. Armies ready to kill and to manipulate, all in the name of defending democracy. The scandal spread across Europe. Belgium, Germany, France, Greece, and Turkey all began their own investigations. Yet the results were mixed. Some governments admitted the existence of stay-behind cells, but downplayed their scope. Others denied outright, dismissing Gladio as a conspiracy theory despite mounting evidence. In Turkey, however, the deep state narrative would take on a life of its own. Many pointed to a shadow alliance of military officers, security services, and ultra-nationalists who carried out assassinations and coups, all under the justification of keeping communism and Kurdish separatism at bay. In fact, Turkish Gladio operatives became infamous for their ruthlessness, with some later linked to heroin trafficking routes and mafia-style corruption. The unanswered questions piled up. Who was really giving the orders? Were intelligence agencies like the CIA and MI6 merely partners, or were they architects of the entire project? Did NATO itself fully sanction the strategy of tension, or had the stay-behind armies become rogue instruments of power, manipulated by domestic elites? The most haunting possibility is this: that Gladio's mission did not end with the Cold War. Some researchers argue that similar networks adapted to the new era, repurposed to fight terrorism instead of communism. Others suspect that Gladio-style operations are still alive, just hidden beneath new names, new acronyms, and new justifications. For the people who lost loved ones to the bombings, the massacres, and the mysterious political assassinations, these revelations offered little comfort. The truth had come too late, buried under decades of lies and half-truths. Gladio's legacy is not simply the violence it unleashed, but the unsettling realization that in times of fear, democracies can betray their own values. That in the name of protecting freedom, secret hands may twist it into something unrecognizable. And so the story of Operation Gladio is not merely history, it is a warning. A reminder that shadows never vanish completely. They only wait for the right light to reveal them. The killing of Patrice Lumumba was not simply an execution, it was the silencing of an idea. But even after his death, the world was not told the truth. What happened next was one of the most deliberate cover-ups of the Cold War. For decades, official records claimed Lumumba had been executed by Congolese rivals. The Belgians and the CIA quietly buried their involvement, hoping history would forget. Newspapers published watered-down reports, while diplomatic cables erased names and redacted motives. But shadows leave traces. In 1975, the U.S. Senate launched the Church Committee, an unprecedented investigation into intelligence abuses. Among the revelations was a chilling fact: the CIA had actively plotted to assassinate Patrice Lumumba. The committee uncovered a scheme involving poisons, covert operatives, and close coordination with Belgium. Though the CIA denied pulling the final trigger, the evidence pointed to a far deeper conspiracy. Meanwhile, in Belgium, journalists and activists demanded answers. For decades, Brussels resisted, until 2001, when a parliamentary inquiry finally admitted what had long been whispered: Belgium bore moral responsibility for Lumumba's death. But moral responsibility is not the same as justice. No Belgian officer, no CIA agent, no Western politician was ever held accountable. The global cover-up succeeded in protecting the architects of the crime. And yet, Lumumba's ghost refused to rest. In 2022, over 60 years after his murder, Belgium finally returned Lumumba's only known remains to his family: a single tooth. A tooth stolen as a trophy by a Belgian officer who had helped dissolve Lumumba's body in acid. It was a grim reminder of how thoroughly the West tried to erase him, and how impossible that erasure was. Patrice Lumumba's body may have been destroyed, but his story lived on. His speeches, smuggled writings, and photographs ignited movements across Africa, the Caribbean, and the Black Power struggles of the West. To many, Lumumba became a martyr, a symbol of Africa's unfinished liberation, of a leader betrayed by the very powers that preached democracy while practicing empire. And the cover-up? It was not just about hiding the crime. It was about ensuring that no one like Lumumba would rise again. In the end, Operation Gladio was never just a secret army. It was a mirror held up to the world's most powerful democracies, revealing how quickly the language of freedom can bend into the machinery of control. It began as a defense against invasion. It became a theater of shadows, where massacres could be blamed on enemies, where elections could be bent, where fear itself was the weapon. When Gladio was exposed in the 1990s, Europe stood briefly on the edge of reckoning. Parliaments demanded answers. Commissions were formed. Journalists dug through the rubble of secrecy. And yet, silence won. The networks were buried deeper, their files locked away, their architects protected by time. What lingers today are fragments, whispers of stay-behind caches, retired operatives who refused to speak, the unresolved massacres that left families without justice. The evidence is scattered, but the lesson is sharp. Gladio shows us that the greatest threats to democracy do not always come from outside. They often come from within. From those who claim to protect it. From the hidden hands willing to sacrifice lives for strategy, to trade truth for power, to turn fear into governance. And so the story closes where it began, in the shadows. Not with certainty, but with questions that will outlive us. How many operations were hidden behind the curtain? How many deaths were written off as accidents, but were in fact engineered? And above all, has Gladio truly ended, or has it only evolved under new names, new wars, new justifications? The silence of governments tells one story. The silence of history tells another. And somewhere between the two lies the truth. Gladio's ghost still walks among us, reminding us that in the dark halls of power, democracy is never as safe as it seems. This is Facts on Trial, answers to questions never asked, helping you understand the world better.